a city under siege. For 15 days it stood on the brink. Streets and houses were flooded, schools and roads closed. Traders lost thousands. Chichester faced a catastrophe. As the rains continued and the flooding increased, time was running out. The city lurched from one disaster to another. Days before Christmas, a fire destroyed a superstore. Then just into the new year, a flood worse than anything that Chichester had seen in 130 years. Almost a year's rain had fallen in 5 months. The River Levant could take no more. Tonight, a fortnight on, they're still pumping water out of Chichester.
This is a massive operation for us. It's the biggest sustained operation that we have ever run, probably the largest operation that has been run by a fire brigade since the East Coast floods in the 50s.
The trouble started for the south and southeast 4 months ago. 12 inches of rain fell in September and October. The water tables rose alarmingly high, and the torrential rain last month compounded everything. The ground simply couldn't soak it up. The Isle of Wight was the first place to be flooded, with the spring tides 2 weeks ago. In Uckfield, East Sussex, a torrent poured down the high street. Shop windows were smashed by the pressure of water. Goods were even seen floating away. Several local people were charged with looting. The rains brought spectacular landslips to Franklin's village near Haywards Heath in Sussex. Landslips which meant people's homes had to be demolished. In Berkshire, the town of Maidenhead was flooded by water from the Thames. Thousands of pounds of damage was caused. At Deal in Kent, homes were swamped when water poured from farmland. Residents tried to build barricades, but they were useless. Then landslips on the Isle of Wight. But all eyes were on Chichester in West Sussex, a city dating from Roman times, best known for its 11th century cathedral. There are streets of fine Georgian townhouses, and one of the most acclaimed regional theatres in the country. It's difficult to say how much of this great city was in peril. Within days, the floods had paralysed traffic, hit trade and caused chaos. If the River Levant had burst its makeshift jam just a few hundred yards up the road, thousands of homes would be awash, along with dozens of shops and businesses. The tension as the drama unfolded was obvious to all of us who were here to witness it. From January the 4th, day one of the floods, there were fears about the strength of the ancient culverts carrying the water from the Levant under Chichester. Would they take the strain? There was real concern that the tunnels wouldn't hold. Sandbag defences had already been breached. If the culverts collapsed, 30 million gallons would gush out.
This is where it's ripping out.
Royal Navy divers used an underwater camera to assess the damage. The pictures, though blurred, reassured the planners they still had time to solve the crisis. But the worries about flooding were still acute. January the 6th, day 3 of the floods, and teams were working hard to protect the city. They were building a 9-foot clay bank. By now, every fireman in the county had been brought in.
We've obviously got some weak points, which these guys are now trying to fill with sandbags to protect this wall so that it won't go away. And also, we have a weak point up here. If we can do this, we hope that it will hold back now for the rest of the time, because it may have to be here for a month.
The River Levant flows into Chichester from the northeast. It runs into a shopping district known as the Hornet. There it goes into a culvert. This was the pressure point where the water built up. If the dam burst, the city's southern section would have been flooded. Plans were drawn up for a mass evacuation of 2,000 homes. This bunker below County Hall became the nerve centre of the emergency operation. A team of 30 working around the clock, from councils, the Rivers Authority, the police and fire brigade. They'd been trained to deal with disasters of all kinds, learning the lessons of Zeebrugge, Hillsborough and Clapham. Now they had their own emergency.
It's coming down, and we've got an awful lot of water, as far as we're concerned, still to come to Chichester.
One of their first tasks to draw up a secret worst-case scenario. They called it Operation Badminton. These were the special contingency plans. They were kept confidential because the council didn't want to scare the public. A team worked round the clock for 2 days to produce this 30-page document. It lists the names of all those at risk in the city, how they'd be evacuated and where they'd be taken. It was a crucial piece of planning that involved 14 organisations.
We looked at a cross-border operation involving our colleagues from Hampshire, whereby, if need be, we would have bussed anything up to these 3,000 people away down the A27 westwards to the Havant Leisure Centre, who would have provided temporary accommodation for those who had to leave their homes.
The people of Chichester weren't told of this secret document. They could only watch the floodwater rising. And they knew the River Lavant was never predictable. After all, in the past 2 winters, it was bone dry, and people worried it might never flow again.
Unfortunately, what happened was there was so much rainfall on top of already wet ground that the water just almost ran off as a sheet down the hills, through the villages to the north of here, unfortunately flooding them, and on its way to the sea, Chichester stood in its path.
By now, day 4, roads were flooding everywhere. It wasn't just local residents affected, but everyone trying to get between east and west.
I've been trying to get to a car park round there and everything's blocked. Just blocked. Can't get through.
It was beginning to look like Spaghetti Junction. 3 miles of piping snaked out of the city, taking the overflow to the sea. The problem was the water level was rising by the hour. It was flowing into the city faster than the fire brigade could pump it out. And then the snow came. Day 5, blizzard conditions, and just as the crisis point was approaching.
It's very touch and go at the moment, because if the earth bank gives way, then literally hundreds of thousands of gallons of water will come into this area amongst a wave of clay, and it's going to be disastrous for all these buildings.
And still the water poured in. Out of mothballs and unseen since the firemen's strike of 1977, wartime Green Goddesses was summoned to help. 14 arrived on day 7. They were needed to relieve the pressure on exhausted fire officers and double the pumping capacity. 2 days later, more help arrived. The emergency planning team decided to call in the army, 100 soldiers from barracks in Maidstone and Aldershot. Their task, to get the city moving again by making the roads passable and to prepare for the worst should it happen. They built 4 Bailey bridges to ease the traffic congestion that had paralysed so much of West Sussex.
We moved from a cold start, having been phoned and brought down here yesterday morning, bringing the stores down yesterday evening, and really the men had not seen the site before and they'd not tackled floodwater before. The bridges themselves are pretty straightforward, and they've managed to build them successfully.
It was an extraordinary sight. Soldiers drafted into a quiet cathedral city in peacetime Britain, involved in the type of operation they'd been trained to perform in trouble spots in other countries. But the floodwaters were still rising. By now the villages around Chichester were taking the brunt. Singleton, Eastdean and Stoughton. Water was still pouring off the downs. All hands were at the pumps. Rescuers were exhausted. They'd been working around the clock. Many people feared the worst.
Well, we're very nervous at the moment.
Right. Sick.
We're hoping that the dam holds. Have you seen anything like this before?
Never. Only on the television in Wales or Devon.
Places like Bangladesh and that sort of thing, but not in Chichester.
The truth was, the residents weren't the only people worried. The experts in the planning bunker also knew time was running out. They needed a lucky break. By now, many shopkeepers hadn't slept for 48 hours. Cellars had been flooded, stock ruined. The worry was no one knew whether worse was to come.
We've actually been established 25 years. I've been here 15, and it's just heartbreaking to see it like this. It really is. I'd rather have given the wool away than see it in this state.
Business had plummeted all over the city. Although only the Hornet was flooded, shoppers were heeding the emergency planners' warnings to steer clear of the city altogether. But it was the flood itself that most of the traders in the Hornet were worried about.
They kept talking about a tidal wave of 1 metre high of slurry and bricks and all sorts of dirty water pouring across from the dam across the road there. So we were worried for our windows.
At its worst, well, we weren't going to bed because we didn't know what was going to happen, but the dam is actually only about 50 yards away from this shop, and we live above the shop, and the fire officer kept saying, it's going to happen, it's going to burst any minute, and we just kept waiting and praying it wouldn't happen.
What the Scott family didn't know was that nature had intervened. In the space of a few seconds, she had done more than the massed ranks of the emergency teams had managed in over a week. The Lavant had burst its banks just east of the city at West Hampnett Mill. A torrent of water flooded down the hastily sandbagged road towards the A27. Millions of gallons were being carried away from the city. This was the lucky break they'd been praying for. The flood water would go onto fields and make its way down to the sea. Some farms would be affected, and some houses and a school, but the emergency teams knew the city itself was now more likely to be spared. They put up sandbags to channel the water down the road and away from the city, which was bad news for the people who lived and worked along its new route. Nick Fry runs a furniture warehouse right in the path of the escaping water. Though it damaged his business, he fully accepted that the priority was to save the city.
This is a very significant point here because the river normally runs under our mill building. It's been split into three, this being a third of the river running through our yard, and they are desperately trying to keep this from flowing back into the river and flooding the town. So they're running it through our yard and down the road and down to the bypass from there.
It's Sunday, day 13 of the floods, and the people of the city have come to give thanks.
We thank you for the spirit of comradeship and mutual help which has flourished in our midst. We pray for all those who have suffered loss or damage to their property and their cherished possessions, and those whose means of livelihood or way of life have been threatened by this catastrophe and the fears it has raised.
But not everyone felt like giving thanks. Julie Kenworthy was forced to abandon her house with her 2 young children when they were caught in the escaping floodwater.
Nobody came to warn us of this situation. This came in on the Thursday, and nobody warned us, came down and said, we advise you to evacuate. Nothing has been done. You hear about them all evacuating people in Chichester, in the surrounding villages, which is fair enough, they have to do that, but nobody's been to see me.
Neither had teacher Peter Johnson been given any warning. He found floodwater pouring towards his house.
Really, it's an act of God, the amount of water that's coming down from the dams. That is quite clear, no one's disputing that. But it makes me really feel quite incensed that the authorities can actually divert water and cause this. This really has meant that we have become sacrificial lambs.
Across the road, a grammar school was flooded and forced to close. 140 pupils were sent home for 3 days. A boiler in the basement was destroyed, and there was other damage running into thousands of pounds.
Why were we given no warning that our school was going to be flooded and our grounds, which houses our sewage works? But there's no doubt in my mind that we were sacrificed for the people of Chichester. I'm not saying that's wrong, but someone's got to help us to cover the costs.
This is a field of winter crops. Some 600 acres of farmland were flooded. Farmers were taking legal advice about compensation. Their agents had to take to the water to see the damage. They say the county council should take responsibility because they claim the water was deliberately diverted away from the city and onto their clients' land.
I think that when they came to put the sandbags in the road, but adjacent to West Hampton Mill, that was controlling an act of God. Whilst I'd be prepared to accept that the breach in the riverbank was an act of God, I think that they were actually diverting the natural stream by preventing that flow falling back into the river level.
But the authorities deny they're at fault. They insist there was no diversion.
There's never been any question that the Lavant was ever diverted. What actually happened was that the water overtopped in the area of the mill up at West Hampton, and the subsequent waters then were kept away from properties to avoid the possibility of danger to life or to property. And essentially that water has now been running off in the area where it would normally go. Clearly there was no question of channeling the water back into the Lavant, because at that time that would have merely added to the problems of the fire brigade down in the Hornet and put an unacceptably high level of water through the city.
We haven't got a crystal ball. We didn't know where it was going to burst its banks. It burst its banks. We reacted as quickly as we could, and we warned people as quickly as we could. And my men were out with sandbags and pumps, as were the fire brigade, trying to help people who were in the path of the floodwater.
But the threat to Chichester wasn't over. Rescue work was continuing day and night. Skiploads of earth were ringed around the dam to form a second barricade. They'd doubled the pumping capacity to 12 million gallons a day, yet still the Lavant was rising. And even when the skips were in place, the fire brigade was saying the dangers were as real as ever.
You're only 2 or 3 inches away. If we don't do something now, it's going to come on us.
But the city shopkeepers said the danger for them was a potentially lethal drop in trade.
Chichester's open, especially the Hornet. We need people to come back here. It's not that difficult to get into Chichester.
The traders held a meeting in a church to decide whether to join forces to seek compensation. And they wanted action now to stop this ever happening again.
There's no point in waiting 50 years, 100 years, whatever, which seems to be the trend. We've got to set up umpteen committees before we can get a decision to have a committee meeting about the committee meeting that's going to organise the thing. So I think that something should have been done a long time ago. And I think it's no point you sitting there and saying something's in hand. How long is it going to take?
Somewhere, somebody along the line, somebody is criminally responsible for what's happened. And they should be, if not sued, hung.
I want somebody's head on it, but I want some names. I don't want people just to say, the council. I want to know the name of the guy that's in charge of the water authorities for down here. I want the guy's name who's responsible for the river authorities. I want his name. I want the guy in the council who was told all about this. I want his name. And I want these people to answer our questions.
The planners say they couldn't have reacted more efficiently, but they do agree valuable lessons have been learned for the future. The Rivers Authority have hired consultant engineers to investigate a range of options. The favourite is to dig a flood relief channel alongside the Lavant into Chichester and renovate the underground culverts. This, theoretically, would carry away all floodwater in future years.
Well, obviously, if we're going to cater for flows up to 8 cubic metres per second, which we've been experiencing over the last few days, we will need bigger channels or culverts in some form or another to take care of the excess water.
It's going to be costly, though, isn't it?
Certainly it will cost a lot of money, but obviously there's been an awful lot of damage and disruption caused in this area which we wouldn't want to experience again.
And experience is one thing Chichester has had. The never-predictable Lavant has flooded 9 times since the 18th century. This flood has cost an estimated £100 million worth of damage in the south. Assessors are busy all around the Chichester area. The woman who lives here is claiming several £1,000s.
In all my days, I wouldn't expect anything like this. People have been wonderful, but they can't do anything. The floor will probably have to come up, everything will have to come up. All the kitchens got to be gutted, a lot.
It was Tuesday this week, day 14, when the emergency teams began to think they were winning the battle. A new giant pump had been installed, heavy rain had been forecast. If it held off, the levels would come down for the first time in a week. The weather was kind, and the flood in Chichester did begin to recede. 750 firefighters had been called into action. They'd pumped out more than 100 million gallons. No one had died, no one had been injured.
I'm happy to say that our plans worked smoothly. As you've seen from the number of organisations involved, it has been a model exercise in teamwork, organisations talking together, resources required have all been sort of married up with the demands. People have worked enormously long hours to protect the people of Chichester and the immediate surrounding areas. I think really it's been a textbook example of how to respond to such a situation.
A sure sign that the crisis is over. Shoppers returning to the city for the extra late January sales, under Christmas decorations that no one's had time to take down. The cost of the operation is well over £1 million, and it's not finished yet. The fire crews could stay in Chichester until the spring, but no one's doubting the worst floods in memory could soon be just that, a memory. The emergency teams at last are quietly confident. The city has been saved.
Thank you.